All right, so let's talk about what we do for some return to sports stuff and consideration. So obviously this is a big topic that we can expand upper extremity, lower extremity, and all those variables that we look for. So yeah, let's kick it off. I think that when you look at return to sport, I think one of the biggest things to appreciate, of course, is the gravity and the speed of the game. And I couldn't emphasize it enough, and I think we should start with this, is that if you're not familiar with the game that you're returning somebody to, I think you have a responsibility to get really familiar. And that could mean that to go or to watch it. I mean, now you have no excuse not to watch something on YouTube or at least see what it's all about to some degree. But I couldn't emphasize enough to get on the sideline as close as you can to a sporting event of that level. Yeah. So if it's a high school athlete, a collegiate athlete, a pro athlete, you just, every time I see it and every time in that position, I'm just like in awe about the speed and the intensity of the game. And you think about what you do in the clinic, you think about the gap between those things and how wide that is. It's just really, really incredible. So I think we got a tall task in front of us always to be like, how do we take someone from the level that they're at to that level of eliteness and performance. And actually, at the end of the day, when you're talking about sport, you're talking about somebody trying to beat somebody else. So it's not 100% effort, but it's probably 110, 120% effort. And especially if you're doing a sport where you're going offense against defense, where you actually have to react to somebody else's stimulus. That's by far our biggest challenge in the game. And it's consistent whether you're in soccer trying to get separation from somebody, or if you're in basketball, or whether you're in football, or even if you're in baseball. I mean, we take it for granted, be like, it's baseball, it's just a pitcher, he's just throwing it just like it is a bullpen. Well, it's not just a bullpen when you've got 2 outs in the bottom of the ninth and you've got to get the number 4 hitter out. Yeah. You need a little something extra, or whatever the situation is.
So there's a few things you said there. I mean, the in-game scenario is always the adrenaline component of it, right? So if you use baseball as the example, somebody in a non-game scenario, they would expect to throw multiple miles an hour slower than they do in a game scenario, and there's nothing different about their implement. Like, the ball is still 5 ounces, their cleats are the same size. The only difference is that maybe there's 50,000 people watching them and more on TV, and somebody that they're competing against that's not on their team on the other side. So there's an adrenaline component, and every sport has those pieces.
And it can't be replicated in any other scenario than competition. So you have to 100% understand that they're going to go out there at 110%. And so when you clear someone, know the speed of the game, the competition they'll be facing, because we'll talk about professional athletes to high school athletes, and especially in high school, you have the difference between a freshman, a sophomore, a junior, a senior. Each year is an exponential change in their physical development, in their speed, their understanding of the game, their awareness. And you take a junior a junior going up against a senior in football, their size difference could be huge. Their competition factor is something you can't replicate in the clinic. You can't replicate it even in the practice setting to some regard. So you have to really, really be confident in the things that you've taken them through, the battery of tests, the physical challenges you've taken them through, to say, that shoulder you dislocated last season, I think it's good to kind of reach out and tackle a guy.
Well, that's the thing. There's a little leap of faith here at some point, right? Like, you've taken their ACL through the triple hop and all the other pieces that you get to that point. But to your point, none of those actually replicate the in-game scenario. So at some point, you've got to say, little leap of faith here to some degree.
Yeah, and I think that's where practice comes in.
Exactly.
And I think this makes it probably the most challenging person to return to sport, frankly, is the adult. The recreational soccer player,
yes,
because they don't practice.
No, right. No.
So it's typically
couch to competition.
Yeah, and the weekend warrior is brutal, right? Versus if you're rehabbing someone who's in a team sport where they're training, 5 days a week and they have 1 or 2 games a week, you can get them into practice in modified venues and modified environments and start to challenge things in a way. But at the end of the day, I'd say that we really look for two main factors. I'd say we look for what's the ability of the athlete to really control their own body in space. Can you really have full control of your own body? So a lot of people talk about how fast are you and how high can you jump and those things, but when you're taking someone to return to sport, that means they're coming from injury. So most likely the injury occurred during deceleration, more so than acceleration. So you have to make sure they can decelerate, and that's what's going to lead them to change direction or change pace, which is going to lead to success in sport, which is getting separation. So if you're in sports, you can think about basketball as whoever scores the most points, but the reality of who wins the game is who gets the most separation. Same thing with soccer, Same thing with football. Can you get separation from your defender? And that requires deceleration, change of pace, change of direction. So we want to make sure the athlete can do that on their own first, and then eventually be able to react to an outside stimulus. And then the second component I would say would be their fatigue resiliency. Is, can you do that for 2 hours?
Yeah.
It's one thing to do a couple sets of 8, or a couple sets of 10, or do a 30-minute PT session, or even a light, 30-minute practice, or even an hour practice. Can you go for 2 hours hard in a game-like situation, and have that endurance component?
I had a phenomenal conversation with one of the PTs we're onboarding right now, and she said that it was kind of eye-opening to go through some of our curriculum and see that the kind of developing a program for someone, maybe the skill-based thing should go before the speed and power, strength and conditioning, because you want to like maximize the learning process of that skill. Normally she does it after all the speed and power and strength and conditioning stuff because she wants them under fatigue. And she was right and / wrong at the same time. She was right in the sense that we need to challenge these people when they have the acquired skill to use it under intensely fatigued states, because you want to see, do they break down and do they start to compensate, because that's what's going to lead to the injury. And then in our learning situation in that moment, it was put a new skill that they're learning for the first time in the forefront. But I think for our interaction, it just kind of resonated with me to say, you have to challenge these athletes under duress and in a tired, fatigued state on the things that are going to be demanded of them in between the lines.
Now, I'll say something to that. I think we've been talking about specifically non-contact injuries. When in our world, we can classify the injury in terms of a contact or a non-contact. Did someone slide tackle them out in the field and took out their limb and they sprained their ankle or sprained their knee in that course? Or did they cut and they had a failure to control their own body? And if it's a non-contact injury, our return to sport curriculum means that they have to become better than they were before. If we get to prior level of function and use some simple measures to grade that, then we should fully expect a re-injury. So if you had an injury with this current body of yours as a tool, as a weapon out on the field, and you got injured in a non-contact way, then to return back to that, you have to become something better than you were, which means the developmental process has to be insane and awesome and time standing, and to fully develop and become a different weapon than you were before. And if it was a contact injury, then maybe what you were before was good enough and it was just kind of luck of the draw. You got slide tackled. You need to work on better separation. But I think that's one key component. But you also mentioned conditioning, and I think people can make a mistake by develop conditioning with ways that maybe are fresh. It's a fresh skill. They just learn how to cut. How we're going to work on cutting, and we're going to do more cutting. Now we're going to do 100 cuts inside of 10 minutes. If you haven't built conditioning in a safe way first, then you're trying to improve conditioning with something that is still very much in the skill category. And so I think it's so critical to develop conditioning with something advanced only after it's built safely.
Yeah. And I want to go back to what you said about change of direction, Tony. And so I think a lot of people understand the progression of change of direction from linear to multi-directional to reactive to competitive. But I don't think we always think about equipment. And we can progress people's equipment. So to your point, like to practice stuff, somebody in flat-soled shoes on turf in a gym space making a cut is completely different than when you put spikes on and get on grass or on turf. On a field scenario, right? The forces go way up, so we can progress things from an equipment perspective too, and that can be kind of sports specific.
Yeah, yeah. I think those two things are all huge, and then I think the other big factor people ask, well, how do you do this? How do you plan for a sport you do or don't know, or all these different variations? And I'm not gonna say it's simple, but the concept is simple, and the concept is take the goal, whatever it is. So if you want to play golf again, or if you want to play basketball or you want to play football, whatever position it might be, take that and then you just work backwards. What are the required things of that position? So let's say for golf, so there's an average golfer, he's going to shoot between 80 and 90 strokes. So his fatigue resistance has got, I would say, wanted to do at least probably 2 buckets of balls to get through his swing and not have breakdown in his spine or in his knee or whatever the injury level is. Doesn't really matter to me, but he should be able to swing maybe through 2 buckets and not really have symptoms if we're going to say, hey, let's go back out and maybe compete in golf. Granted, 18 plus of those strokes are going to be putts, so you're probably doing 50, 60 fairly hard full swings. but still we want to train that through the fatigue state, so that practice is actually more difficult than a game or competitive environment. And then break it down to like, all right, like how many swings does he have to do? He's got to do, say it was about 60 to 80 swings, and then we're gonna make it from there, how many swings with the wedge, how many swings with the driver, and then from there, what's appropriate. So as we get closer down to the thing, let's break it down and say, okay, I only want you to do wedge through 9-iron. You're gonna do 20 swings that are there, and then maybe even lower level than that, be like, let's do 20 half swings with the pitching wedge and the sand wedge. Mm-hmm. And then lower level than that, I just want you to take your wedge and just do shadow swings where you're not hitting the ball and you're not focusing on contact, you're just going through the motion, right? And then a level below that is, let's use a medicine ball and just do the same movement with the medicine ball, so we have some load and we're doing it without thinking about hitting the target or the object. And then below that, it's, can we just tolerate trunk rotation with like a chopping motion or a lifting motion? And you just keep chipping away at it down to the basics, where you end up with someone in a supine on the ground doing lower trunk rotations, as their baseline foundational rotational movement. So the challenge here is, can you take a sport and take a movement in that sport? Let's say an outside hitter for volleyball. What does that motion look like? What's the expectation of that athlete? And then just piece it down. How many reps do they have to do at the peak level? What do you want? What's your goal? And then let's start cutting that. What's step by step what has to be accomplished, and then put a time frame to it. We talked about tissue adaptation in another KIMEcast as far as what that takes and how long it takes, and it varies by person. So even though you might say, hey, this is my process, I want to go through all these steps, somebody might jump 4 or 5 steps really quickly, or somebody else might take more time to those steps just based on their body, their adaptation, their tissue, the degree of the injury, and the degree of competition they're playing in.